We usually expect better weather when we come, so it's nice. But thanks for having us again. It's great to see many familiar faces. I'm just going to basically talk about some of the questions we're trying to answer out at Stock Cove, give you an update of what we've done since the last time, and maybe go over some of the things some of you may already know, but also kind of give you an idea about the overview of what we're been up to. And then talk a little bit about some of our plans for the future, and then Don's going to talk more about a topic that a lot of people are interested in the province too, about Paleo and other parts of the research that we're doing. So first I'm just going to talk about some of the questions that we're trying to answer at Stock Cove, and here's some of the beautiful artifacts we get from there. We have a huge range of artifacts, but these are what I've been focusing a lot on, and what we're doing in the province now is actually doing some work out at the rooms at the Provincial Archaeology Museum, looking for the source of this material that they're making all these inlays out of. But first, being an anthropologist, archaeologist, there's some larger questions that Stock Cove is really capable of answering for us, we think. That's what we're trying to go out and do every summer. And so first I'm going to give you the anthropological side of these things, that we like to talk about to each other as anthropologists and archaeologists, which is sometimes quite different than what most people are interested in. We talk to each other a lot. One of the things that we think, and that some of the interesting research that Stock Cove could answer, is how different people here in this area really adapted to and interacted with their climate and the ecosystems here. So climate change may have played a role in a lot of the movement of people here in the past, over the past 5,000 years or so since Stock Cove has been occupied. The use of resources, which is again what we're trying to do right now, is figure out where they're getting some of these things that they're making the tools and other objects that we find at the site with. So we're going to be out with Warwick Seaward here, going out in the boat, looking for the source of this material. And we've been doing that at the rooms too, to see how far this stuff has been traveling. Looking at cultural interaction, because as many of you already know, we have evidence of almost every single culture that lived on the island at Stock Cove. So we have this really cool laboratory to look at the different people that live there, but also how they interacted, because there may be overlap between some of these cultures. So they're very different cultures acting in a similar kind of space and environment. So that's a really interesting question anthropologically. And then, why did people ultimately leave this place that was drawing them for hundreds, if not thousands of years in some cases? So all of these things are tied to each other. They're all answerable questions, perhaps, from Stock Cove, and the things that we're going to try to really get to. But really the questions, we've been talking a lot about this, Don and I and some of you may know, John Irwin, who worked out here with us in 2009 and continues to work with us in Newfoundland and St. John's. But there's some simpler questions that, anthropologists, we like our big theoretical questions and things, but there's really some simpler questions we're trying to answer in many ways. And so the simple questions are things like, who was at the site? We still don't really know the extent of how big some of these occupations, the people that were living there. Were they small camps that were only seasonally occupied and were there for all year round? Was it a village, an aggregation site? When were they there? How long did they occupy the site? How many times did they come back to the site and use this site? Very simple kinds of straightforward questions that we still are trying to get a grip on. What were they doing there? Were they there to hunt seals? Were they down there to hunt caribou? Were they there for ideological or religious or other reasons? There's still a lot of things we don't know about that. And why were they doing those things, and why did they stop? So in many ways, these are kind of a more straightforward, simple questions that need to be answered, and I think actually in many ways are more intriguing questions than our anthropological questions, because there's still so much we don't know at the site. Now, most of you are probably very familiar with Stock Cove, having lived here for a while. But there's actually a couple of different sites we've identified. There's Stock Cove proper, which is the main part of the site, which is out near the head, around in this beautiful cove. And then in 2010, is that when we were there? In Stock Cove West, we identified the site in 2009, and we spent a lot of time in 2010 excavating at that site. So there's a couple, and that has different cultural occupations at that site, and some of the same ones, but different kinds of things going on. So that's the main area of the site, and we still haven't even learned where that dotted line really should be. Part of what we're going to be doing in the future is figuring out where the limits of the site are, but it's huge. We've gone way up on this. It gets pretty steep up there as you go to the west or northwest, and we have not, everywhere we kind of put out a test pit and we found things coming out. Even way up in the woods, up on these high terraces, there's stuff coming out of there. And it's things you wouldn't expect so far away from the water, like harpoon end blades. But like I mentioned, there's almost every kind of culture at the site that we have on Newfoundland. We have different layers, including European, 17th century European at least, and probably later, definitely later. We have recent Indians, the ancestral Gothic, and probably Gothic as well, which John can talk more about. We have the largest component appears to be the Dorset Paleo Eskimos, and we have dates for them ranging between 1,600 years ago to about 1,300 years ago, maybe a little bit even later than that. Those are the radiocarbon dates we have, but we think it's probably even a longer occupation. We do have some even earlier Paleo Eskimo people known as the Grosswater, that are found in Labrador and on the islands, and so they date to a little bit earlier than that. And we have Maritime Archaic, the first people probably to have occupied the island, unless there's some people who have some more fringe theories about who was here before that, but we know the Maritime Archaic people were here for at least 5,000 years, and we have some evidence at the site that they were at Stock Cove, including also Stock Cove West, so we have them at both sites. And we also know that these things have been found throughout the area. So we have this really interesting, long history of occupation at the site. And in terms of research, and there's John standing on the beach there in my tent where we camp. It's a beautiful place, but it's also a challenging place to work because of all the trees and everything as well. But in terms of research, many of you probably even going back to the 80s remember Doug Robbins perhaps being, does anyone remember Doug Robbins being here working at Stock Cove? In the 80s, even the provincial archaeologist that we have now, Martha Drake, worked at the site when she was an undergrad at MUN on the same site, so it's a long history of research, but the main research was Doug Robbins' master's thesis research, where he discovered a lot, and he focused on the Dorset Paleo-Eskimo time period, and he found this jumble of rocks. This looks like a jumble of rocks to most of us, right? Because it is. But it's also evidence of different features, well, what we archaeologists call features, basically kind of like furniture and paving and house floors and things like that, which he interpreted as a longhouse. Now, I've actually gone through this back and forth, and I've looked at where the artifacts were, and I'm not convinced that it's a longhouse. I think it's actually a bunch of houses, or at least a few houses that are overlapping across this site. And so it's definitely architectural, it's definitely Dorset, but it's not definitely a longhouse. But it is still a very interesting occupation level, and tons of artifacts that we found from there. Again, the end blades, we call them end blades. They're actually just the stone tips of harpoons. So there's a big harpoon that these things would have tipped. We have lots of domestic tools, scrapers, lots of little tiny blades that are called microblades. A big diversity of tool forms, but primarily what we have seems to be this is a place where they're making these end blades, because we found more end blades, and Robbins too found more end blades than almost any other tool at the site, or except microblades, and way larger numbers than any other Dorset site ever found, even including Fort Schwa in terms of the area that we've researched. Now, they have a much larger area out of Fort Schwa and a lot more houses, so in terms of total end blades, they probably surpass us, but we've only excavated 12 square meters, and then within those 12 square meters, we have 250 end blades, which is just an enormous amount. So in many ways, this appears to be some kind of factory for harpoon end blades, and that's a really interesting thing that they're doing at the site. And they're very specific types of end blades, and I'll go through a little bit of that. They're largely made from this, what we call patinated shirt, but a lot of people colloquially call it Trinity Bay shirt, because it's only really, well, where it's found mostly And that's what we're trying to define at the rooms. Where it's found mostly is in Trinity Bay, and where it's primarily found is at Stock Cove and in Dildo Island, those sites that are big, these big Dorset sites. So we have, this is, I know charts are fun to look at, but where the Trinity Bay chert arrow is pointing at, that is Patnea chert. The little bar on the left is recent Indians. The rest is all these Dorset layers, and it's over 60% at least. And in Stock, at the site where we've dug, part of the site where we've dug at Stock Cove, it's even greater. It's over 70% that they're using this material in terms of inlays, particularly. And they're using various other materials, but the Dorset Paleo Eskimos love this material. Now, we don't know where it comes from. Geologists tell us that it doesn't come from Trinity Bay chert, but I'm not sure how well that's mapped. It doesn't come from Trinity Bay. They say the closest source may be Conception Bay, but the stuff we're finding, and Don was talking to some of you earlier, the stuff we're finding is these really huge chunks, and we're finding just probably literally tons of, if you measured it all, tons of this Trinity Bay chert. I mean, you're not going to haul those big chunks and things for that long a distance. And then when we look at the rooms, as we're going through the collections of material at the museum, what we're finding is that it doesn't really travel very far out of Trinity Bay so far. I'm not finding any of it showing up in Dorset sites in Bona Vista, or there's not very many Dorset sites in Conception Bay, so it's a little bit of a problem. But it seems to be focused here, so this may be part of the reason why they're coming here, but it's also part of the signature. It's a part of their identity of these people in this part of the world. So it's an interesting thing that we're trying to solve.
Do you have samples of it with you?
No. That would have been a good idea, Steve. Thanks for bringing it up now.
Just wondering what we would be looking
No,
for.
I can show you. Yeah, what it is, it's actually it mostly appears as a white chert, but what it does is it starts out as a gray-green, really like fine-grained chert. It's a nice quality chert, but as it weathers, it goes through this diagenetic process. So it starts, the outer part of the chert starts to mineralize and becomes a chalky surface. It's almost, you can even scratch it in some places, and that's why they're actually grinding it, and they're erasing all of their different methods they're using to create this and making them very smooth, beautiful little inlays at Stock Cove. But they're not doing that in other places. You don't find that grinding as much. Even at Dildo, they're doing something quite different over at that site. So it's this chert that transforms itself through natural processes, which is kind of interesting ideologically if you're a Paleo Eskimo and white is an important color to you maybe. Are they allowing the chert to do that? Are they favoring the chert when it's white, or are they doing this process themselves? Are they working it after it's already undergone this process? So there's some really interesting things going on, but we just don't know where it comes from right now. So we think because the weather's white, it's probably going to look like a white outcrop, just because of how the weather is. But it's actually a grayish green. The material itself starts out as a grayish green. So we're doing some tests to see how long that it takes to develop that patina as well, because it may be a way to date some of these things to measure how thick that white, chalky exterior is. So it's interesting in itself. So if any of you guys know of the source of white, chalky material, there's some interesting rocks just right in Ricks Harbor that are called the chalk rocks that we kind of go out and check out and see if it's. But I think I'm not sure how much they stick up out of the water, but there's some areas in Bull Island that might be the source as well.
Is it possible that it would be underwater?
It is possible. That's another problem, right? Sea levels have risen since the Dorset, and this island is subsiding. The other side of the island is kind of raising, but this part of the island is sinking. There's kind of some effects that are going on with isostatic, sea level and glacial processes are changing. I don't know. So it could be underwater. It could be used up. We don't know. So there's some things that we don't know about. For those of you that were around last year, you know that we were out there digging, rain or shine, a lot of rain actually. We opened up another 6 square meters, so in total we've only dug 12 square meters, and some of this is purposeful, some of it's not so much purposeful. I say purposeful because we're trying to conserve the site as much as possible. It's part of the ethic of archaeology, is trying not to create conditions that the site will erode and will lose some valuable data. The non-purposeful side of it is that we just haven't got enough funding to do a whole lot more than what we've been able to. But we've been focusing on some questions, and so we only need parts of the site to answer some of these questions. But we did find some evidence of a Dorset structure, and we do think that color may be important. White and red are very important colors to many cultures, including the Dorset. And what we think we have is an overlapping structures, kind of like Robin's found. We have a bunch of, they're probably using stones from other structures when they move back to the site and reconfiguring structures. So it's kind of difficult to tease out the different occupations sometimes, but we're seeing a lot of evidence of architectural features, including this nice little cache or central feature in the first year we were out there. It's just, the place where we're digging, it's just greasy black soil, and that has a lot to do with what the Dorset we're doing. It's telling us a story there, and trying to get some money to do a little bit of research and do soil examination, because it's going to give us some information about the residue in the soil, but it's probably seal oil and things that they're butchering in that area.
Christopher, do we know what your structures were made of? Like maybe a rock foundation, but the structure itself, any idea?
It probably, because there was enough wood in this area, even back then when it was a bit colder, they would have had, they generally tend to dig down a little bit, have a structure that has a rock outline, and then they would have a superstructure, like a tent, that would have wood, and then they would have skins over that. And then the rocks would also hold down the skins around the edge. That's what we think was probably the main structure. And these were probably, the structures generally, single-family Dorset structures are only 3 to 4 meters wide, but sometimes you find them a little bit bigger. And in a hierarchy where you do have those houses, they can be very long, very large. But we do have just this greasy black soil. It gets really fun to dig in when it's raining, because everything just gets covered in it. So then we go down to the beach and we start screening with water down there. But we found a lot more evidence of structure and structures this year, and so a lot of new information about what to do next, depending on our different questions, and I'll talk about them. So getting to some of the questions that I mentioned is what are some of the reasons why they might be down there? Well, we think the Dorset, based on the animal bones that we're finding at the site, the Dorset levels in the site appears to be almost entirely sea mammal hunting, and that doesn't surprise any of us that know about Dorset, because that's their main subsistence, is that they go out and hunt seals, primarily harp seals. And we do have harp seals. We also have some harbor seals. And interestingly, our final analysis last year by Lindsay Swinnerton, she found bearded seal, which is an interesting find. We also have some waterfowl, probably duck of medium size, and some beaver. We're not sure about the caribou bone. It's in a level that could be either it's kind of on the border of recent Indian and perhaps the later occupations of Dorset. But we definitely do have caribou in recent Indian levels. So there does seem to be some shifts, and we found cod bones last year too, as well as seal. But the Dorset still appear to be primarily seal hunters, which is what they're known for primarily throughout the range in Newfoundland and Labrador. That's, you can see this picture there. This was a picture of, a harp seal a couple of years ago, and that was just right out here, waiting at her. So what I'm doing now, and what we're doing at the museum and studying, and hopefully we'll have something to report to you guys soon, is looking at how Dorset think about the design of these beautiful artifacts that we see here. So one of the things I'm doing is taking all these measurements based on the ridges and lengths and weights and everything. The design aspect of it is telling us a lot about how far these people from Stock Cove were interacting with others and how far they were traveling, whether they had ideas about themselves that were different even among other Dorset groups. So I've been spending my time doing this along with the raw material studies. The Dorset and Stock Cove do this weird thing that I cannot really understand why, because you don't see them doing this anywhere else It pops up a little bit on the little island, but in very low numbers. Occasionally in other places you see it. You see it with earlier gross water occasionally, but they'll do these fine serrations along the edges. Some guy must just be sitting there with a little microwave and chipping it around the whole edge. But you only see this at Stock Cove, and there's not really a practical reason for doing this. You know, it's not like you're creating a knife with these things or putting on the tips. It might have some extra cutting ability, but I don't see why it would be. It actually would create greater friction, I think, in terms of piercing. But so it might just be something about their identity, the way they think about themselves. It might be a couple of guys that fancy themselves craftsmen and just love making beautiful little things because they're making tons of these things. And
Chris, the Paleo Indians on the plains used to do that to sharpen, and how they did it was they hit it along the edge.
yeah, and the bigger,
right?
So you're right. The Paleo Indians would do that. They would create these very parallel flaking techniques that you only see that were very standardized, and that was using soft hammer and some pressure flaking.
Yeah.
But these things, this is blown up. This thing is only about this big, and these serrations to be this regular, and it's almost hard to see with the unaided eye. You can see it just looks like these really nice little serrations. So it's fine, intricate work for somebody to spend time doing this. And you know, I have 100 of them, like just beautiful little things like this. So it's something that's really interesting that they're doing at Stock Cove. But one of the things we do, here's another beautiful graph everybody loves. What this basically says is that through time, what we're seeing is the grinding of those things, the serration of those things, and this process called tip fluting, which is a way that they sharpen at least one edge, is becoming more and more standardized through time. So it's almost as if there's a lot of diversity when they first get there, but through time they start having a greater sense of themselves and who they are and how they do things. And we see the diversity in the way they do things start to narrow. So it seems like they're focusing in on identity. Now, an alternative explanation is that as they're starting to abandon the site, there's just not as many people making these, and so only a few people are making them, so you might not have as much diversity. So there's some alternating hypotheses, but for something that's going on that's creating this narrowing of diversity within the tool forms. But we're also finding some other interesting things. I don't want to bore you too much with the metrics of English. We're finding some larger objects. We have some nice big points that are associated with Dorset. We're finding, last year particularly, we found a lot more of these lances. So these may be evidence that they're hunting something other than seal, but they are also very capable of hunting seal these. But Tim Rastu makes a lot of these things, but some of these are being used perhaps for caribou hunting, which was what Doug Robbins originally thought the Dorset might have been here doing, is catching the caribou as they're moving, migrating along the isthmus, basically the corridor of TCH now. And for the first time at Stock Cove, we found some soapstone lamp fragment, which is interesting too, because we have wood here at the site. They could have been burning wood and warming their houses and cooking with it, but they're still maintaining some of these Arctic traditions, which is where they come from originally. Probably burning seal oil here, and if you know anything about some of these lamps, they're very important ideologically to families, and are curated for long periods by families and are cared for very carefully. So aren't abandoned lightly, but they continue to be used even in places where they're not really as practical as they would be in places where you don't have a lot of wood or anything, a way to heat your house otherwise.
So we bring them with them.
So they're probably getting this material from Fleur-de-Lis. John Irwin, who excavated at Fleur-de-Lis, which is a big soapstone quarry on the island of Newfoundland, identified this material as likely coming from Fleur-de-Lis. And that material is actually traveling up into Labrador as well and being traded around. So they're bringing the traditions with them, if not the stone. And then those of you who are around, when did I do this? 2012. I brought out the crazy geophysicist to the site with his radar and magnetometry, because one of the things we try to do, again, in terms of trying to preserve the site as much as possible, is to see what's underneath the ground without digging. So while this looks like a big mess, it actually showed us that in the middle is our interpretation. There's actually a lot of different structures underneath the surface, including one that's 2 meters underneath, that's rectangular, which is really odd, and probably, well, I think it must be maritime archaic. So that's what I'm hoping to get money for to come out next year, is to dig down, which is 2 meters, it's going to be a big dig, to get down to see if this is actually a maritime archaic structure, because if so, it may be the only one. There's no maritime archaic structures that have really been documented on the island, so it could be very important. So what next, very quickly, and I'll let Donna, it's not too long on this. We're going to continue to figure out who was there and when. We're going to try to expand it into deeper time periods, because that's a really interesting part of the site and kind of a section of part of the site. We're going to try to answer those anthropological questions, including environmental, cultural interaction, when they abandoned Dorset, particularly abandoned, but also the maritime archaic, and try to find that Trinity Bay church. So we have a lot to focus on in the future, and so this next fall is when we put in our big new grant request. So we're going to try to get money for at least a few years to make sure that we can continue to come out here. So we're going to be working with you guys as much as possible, and hopefully try to get some students interested in joining us out there as well. Any more questions on my portion of the?
Chris, you mentioned that potential of 6 feet 2 meters deep. So is that in an area where a landslide would probably be that deep?
That's a possibility, but I've done test pits in that portion of the site, and it is kind of back where there could be some slumping, but it doesn't look as if that's the case. What we're going to basically end up doing likely is to dig through a lot of other materials so we get down that far. So it's going to generate a ton of, probably literally a ton of stuff to get there. But I don't think it's not the big sterile fill that's overlying it. It's actually cultural layers in that 2 meters all the way down. And the other portion of the site that we've dug so far, we've already gotten down to over just about a meter, and we're not to the bottom of that. So it's a really deeply leveled site, stratified site.
Thank you for coming. I want to thank the community of Sunnyside. We also have representatives here from the Newfoundland Labrador Archaeological Society, so if anybody wants to join and support this new organization, I would recommend that. I also want to thank my university, Eastern Illinois University, for providing some funding to get me up here this summer. So today I thought I'd talk a little broadly about the Beothuk who are living in this area of Trinity Bay before Europeans and immediately after, and I'm going to try to tell you why this area is really important in the Beothuk story. When European fishermen first arrived in the early 16th century, the Beothuk were a coastal people, and you see this clearly in Trinity Bay, where these sites that date to right when Europeans arrived, and before Europeans arrived, are all located in the coast. One thing about the Beothuk is, unlike the Paleo Eskimos, the Dorset, they tended to settle in the bottoms of deep bays and inlets, which is pretty smart, because what you can do from the bottoms of these deep bays and inlets is you can access a wide variety of little sort of microenvironments and a wide variety of food resources. So here's a famous harp seal picture again. So from these inner bays and inlets, you can reach out, you can go out and get harp seal that are farther out on the coast. There's resources right there, cod, seabirds, harp seal, and then you can go inland and get caribou. So the great thing about living in a place like this, at the bottom of the bay, is you can go out to the outer islands on a day trip, you can go in the interior, and you can stay there, and you have access to all these different kinds of foods. If you want to think for a comparative sake, if you're on Little Fogo Island, you have some food there, but you'll never eat caribou, right? If you're in Red Indian Lake, you're too far inland to get anything but caribou, right? So if you want to have a lot of options, which we know hunting and gathering people like, the best place is somewhere like this, where you can keep your eye on a bunch of different kinds of resource environments.
Don, did they eat much cod, and how did they catch them?
We don't know much about cod at all. In fact, that's the first time I heard that we had bones, is when Chris just said that, that we have bones. Now, it's hard to imagine that they weren't doing some fishing. Part of it is probably a preservation issue. Part of that is the preservation itself is poor. Part of that is archaeologists. Old methods of doing archaeology weren't probably keeping an eye out for the tiniest bones. So probably a little bit of all three of those things. Not as much as Europeans, poor preservation, poor archaeological sampling strategy. So I'll get to the reason briefly at the end of why the Beothuk were in Red Indian Lake, because I just said that it's an irrational place to live. But we all know that's where they were, right? So I'll get to that in a minute. And that'll also tell you why this part of the Beothuk story is really important. For now, I want you to know that the Beothuk were a coastal people when Europeans first arrived, and like all Newfoundlanders, they made their living from the sea. But the sea did more than just provide for these people. It was also a spiritually important place to the Beothuk. With only one exception, which you can see right there, the Beothuk buried their dead on the coast, and mostly on islands. I think it's, well, yeah, the yellow dots, these are all burial locations. The yellow dots are burials on islands. So basically, all their dead were buried on the coast, and most of those were buried on islands, especially little islands. Shawnajith had said that the souls of the dead traveled to the happy island after death. So if you think about it, these little islands are sort of like a microcosm of their kind of belief system, right? You bury the dead on these little islands. They envision the afterworld as a kind of happy island. Islands are also bird places. 99% of the province's bird rookeries are on islands, and my colleague Todd Christensen and I think that this matters, that birds mattered a lot to the Beothuk. And we think that, well, we know that the Beothuk buried their dead with some actual birds that were sort of sewn into their clothes. We also know that, well, we think that a lot of these Beothuk pendants, which were buried with the dead, represent aspects of bird anatomy, like wings and feet and feathers and things like this. So we think that we also know that birds are places, or islands are places where birds live. So our idea is that the Beothuk enlisted birds as spirit messengers to bring their dead to these happy island afterworld. So it's kind of an idea, but the point is that the coast wasn't just a place where these people made a living. I think the coast had sacred importance to them. It's where they buried their dead. And it's obviously also a place where they lived, and it was a sort of socially significant place for them too. All right, so let's get to Stock Cove. So you see some of this at Stock Cove. The Beothuk were clearly here before Europeans arrived. This includes Stock Cove proper, where Chris was showing you, to the eastern end of the cove, and also on the western end of Stock Cove, where we excavated in 2010. Here we found lots of prehistoric Beothuk material, things like these little arrowheads, scrapers, blades, whetstones. We also found a half a dozen or so pits. Can't see it very well, but right about where that trowel is, right to the left of it, there's a little earthen pit. It's cut off a little. Maybe I can erase this for a second. Or not. Okay. So it's a little earthen pit. You see a little ring of stones maybe around it. So these are little fire pits. We got carbon dates from some of these pits, and they date to about the mid-1300s. So this is before Europeans arrived. One of the pits we excavated produced quite a bit of animal bone, and this gives us some indication of what they were eating. So there's a whole specialty in archaeology, zoo archaeologists. These people, you know, they look at animal bones and they identify the species. As you can tell, the resolution depends on how big of a bone it is, what the portion of the bone is that they have. So sometimes they can just say it's a mammal that lived on land. But other times they can get pretty accurate and say it's within the auk family, or it's caribou, but seal, but we don't know if it's harp seal or harbor seal, things like that. The really interesting one here is a possible Arctic fox, because they're not native to the island, but there are accounts of them rafting in on the ice in the spring. So this might be a good seasonal indicator that people were there in the spring when these animals might have rafted over. But I think what it shows you is the diversity of foods that they were eating, which goes back to the point I was making just a couple minutes ago, that you want to have a lot of options. And look, they're exercising it. They're eating birds, they're eating caribou, they're eating seals, you know, maybe fox. You know, so they're doing a lot of different kinds of things. We also found a really interesting stone pile. I think I talked about this maybe once before. This pile of these red flagstone stones, they're actually the ones that Chris showed you that the Dorset are putting their houses on, these pavings, right? So we found a pile of them, and we were wondering, you know, what's going to be in this pile? Well, we excavated it, and this is what we found. There's actually one quartz crystal I'm not showing, but 5 quartz crystals and a little piece of specularite, which is a kind of hematite. It's basically mineralized red ochre. So I showed this to a geologist at my university. I'm like, what's this stone? And he took a little scratch plate out and, you know, scratched it on it and left a red streak on it. And I think what's great about it, and then I'm like, so how do you get this off? How do you get the ochre off the stone? He's like, yeah, use something really hard, harder than, like, how about quartz? He's like, yeah, that would be great. So what we might have right here is buried under this pile of stones a little ochre making kit or something. And, you know, we know that the Beothuk, they're the Red Indians, right, of Newfoundland. We know that they cover their bodies in red ochre. And I think what's really interesting is this lends support to the idea that red ochre had more than just it was more, some people say, oh, it's a way to keep the insects off and maybe camouflage. This lends support to the idea that there was something sacred about it. If you're going to have this special little toolkit that you're using to produce this powder under a big pile of red maroon stones, suggests that this was sort of important to their spiritual life. So again, the sea wasn't just a place where they made a living. These places had social significance, spiritual significance to these people. So Stock Cove was an important place for the Beothuk before Europeans arrived. You could find food here. They probably had social significance, and we might imagine that, you know, rituals and other things took place here too. Stock Cove and Trinity Bay were still important to the Beothuk when Europeans arrived, when John Kai later and colonists sailed here in 1612. I'm sure everybody knows the story. The Cooper colonists sailed from Conception Bay to Trinity Bay in the fall of 1612. They came to make friendly contact with the Beothuk, and they did. Not very far from here, probably right over at Frenchman's Island. Before the encounter, the colonists spotted numerous Beothuk camps along the shoreline. Bill Gilbert produced this nifty map, which is going to be a little hard to read, but I'm sure some of you have seen stuff like this, where he's trying to link the colonists' observations of where they saw houses to places on the land. So, for example, there's Cooper's Cove, and then this says 3 of their houses, and then here is 9 savage houses where that could be Stock Cove. So right around Stock Cove, John Guy is seeing 9 houses. This makes sense. This was a popular place before Europeans arrived, so it makes sense that Beothuk were still living here into the 1600s. The problem from an archaeologist's perspective is it's very hard to find Beothuk sites that date to, let's say, before the mid to late 1600s. And the reason is because they're going to look like prehistoric sites. Right? I mean, think about like when native people first made contact with Europeans, they don't have access to metal right away. So in a lot of ways, the signature, they're sort of the way they would look to archaeologists is they'd still be using stone tools. Right? So the only, later on with Boyd's Cove, as a lot of you are familiar, they're taking nails and they're hammering them into points. But early on, there wouldn't have been enough Europeans here, not enough interaction with them. They're not doing that. So it's very hard to see very early historic Beothuk sites because they'll look like prehistoric sites. And even the dating, those of you familiar with archaeological dating techniques, usually the resolution isn't fine enough where, you know, they might give or take 100 years, which is not fine enough to get the accuracy we want. But we found this last year, right? This is this is the earliest evidence, you know, the Beothuk here during European, you know, after Europeans arrived. This is ballast stone. This is stone brought over by Europeans in the hulls of their ships. They bring this stone over, dump it onto a beach, fill the boats full of fish, right, with the weight, sail back, and they leave this stone here. And what native people would do in some cases is use that stone to make stone tools. So this is right now, it doesn't look like much, but the best evidence we have of a Beothuk presence after Europeans arrived at Stock Cove. And what this is a piece of European stone that looks like it's been worked by native people. Yeah, this is actually a pretty big deal.
It looks like ice.
Yeah, it's a cool, it's like kind of a honey colored or cola colored stone. We have, what further complicates things is Europeans would sometimes use that stone to make gun flints. So they'll flake the stones. So we always think of native people working stone, Europeans were working stone to make these gun flints. But the fine working on this and the placement of it suggests that this is more of a cutting tool than anything else.
And dead stone is not found in the province?
No, it's not. It's European. Okay. Certainly, the colonist observations indicate that there is a significant Beothuk presence here in the early 1600s, and we know that this place was important to the Beothuk before Europeans arrived for at least 300 years or so. We also know that the Beothuk had some good relations with the colonists. There's a friendly encounter that you know about at Frenchman's Island, and it appears that there might have been a few others too. But obviously, relations with Europeans start to go downhill because the Beothuk abandoned this area by around the mid-1600s. Coincidentally, in quotes, this happens at just about the time when we start finding European material in Stock Cove. So this is from Stock Cove West, but at Stock Cove West we have ceramic earthenware, Portuguese earthenware, which is common in sort of 16th, 17th century Avalon Peninsula, so Normandy stoneware, Portuguese redware, this kind of ceramics date to that time period. Disappears. We have gun flint. That's what I was talking about. See that material? That's European stone that Europeans probably made that, fishermen made that, and it's this mechanism that you use in a firearm as sort of the firing mechanism. So that's where it would go. So we have that. We have gun shot up there. You can see the little gunshot up there. By the way, there's no evidence that the Beothuk ever used firearms. In fact, we know later on they destroyed firearms when they found them. And then we have pipe bowls. Barry Galton, who works at Ferryland, I sent him a picture. He thinks this might reference William Walker Evans, I believe is his name, who there's a 1 and a 2, but he's found pipes like this at Fairyland. They date to about the, I think like 1640s, 1670s, somewhere around then. So the point is, all this is converging at about that time, mid-1600s. This is the time, oh, and I'll add one more. And some of you know about the winter house found at Frenchman Island by Barry Galton and Steve Mills, which they think date to this exact same time period. In fact, these things could be the same people that are at Stock Cove and living at the winter house down here. So what we have found, oh, and one more thing. We've also found evidence, this was just last year, at Stock Cove of a fire that dates to this time period. The fire extends across the site, and it dates to 1640, 1670. It's just this big, covered sort of right about where the Beothuk, right above the ancestral Beothuk stuff. And we've carbon dated this fire event. Okay, so here's the convergence of things. We have historic documents that tell us the Beothuk are out of here by mid-1600s. We have the sudden appearance of European artifacts that date to this time period, the mid-1600s, and then the Beothuk never returned. And we also have a fire now that dates to this time period. So what happens next is that the Beothuk retreat north and eventually into the interior to places like Red Indian Lake that I told you early on was a difficult place to make a living, and we know then how that story ends. The significance of Lower Trinity Bay and Stock Cove in all of this is that this is where the Beothuk story takes that turn. This is where that Beothuk road to Red Indian Lake begins, right? We know that this place was really important to them before Europeans arrived. We know it was important to them after Europeans arrived. They stay here as long as they can. So for them to give this up tells you that that was not their choice, right? They would have liked to probably stayed there. So this important part of the Beothuk story, this is sort of that turning point where they start this long road to eventually retreating north to places like the beaches and Boyd's Cove, and then eventually into the interior of the island. So obviously, there are signs of Europeans and a fire, and then after that, scarcely any signs of the Beothuk. So I guess Chris and I can answer a couple questions if you have them, but that's what I have for you.
So roughly from the time of the exodus from this area to their extinction was 200 years.
Mm-hmm. Mid-1600s, yep, 1700s. I think that certainly by the mid-1700s, they have become an inland people. So they're still on the coast for a while. They leave this area, but they're in Bonavista Vista Bay for a while. They're in Notre Dame Bay. Boyd's Cove, they're fine. But eventually, I would say by the mid-1700s, they're an inland people. So, again, we don't want to, it's easy to project what you know from history back in time. So what we know from the history accounts is the Beothuk living in Red Indian Lake. But my opinion on that is that that's a very recent way of life for them. When you look at the archaeology, it tells you that they're a coastal people, right? There's actually very few sites deep in the interior that date to before Europeans arrived. If they're going in interior, they're like at Russell's Point, which some of you might know about. That's just interior. And remember what I told you early on, if you're playing it safe, Why would you go all the way to Red Indian Lake if you can get caribou 10, 20 kilometers inland, right? You're not getting any more by going 50 kilometers or more, right? You just get the same stuff. So the ideal strategy is to be interior where you can get caribou, but close enough to the coast if you have to, if you need to find other food. So to me, the Beothuk at Red Indian Lake tells you a little bit of their desperate situation, that they're trying to make a go at it way in the interior where you don't really have a lot of options other than caribou.
And then they ran into conflict with birds.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was a conflict on the coast that, especially with salmon fishermen, seemed to have been the big thing. Because remember, they're in these interior, way in the bottoms of Bonavista Bay, Notre Dame Bay, Boyd's Cove, Lower Trinity Bay. For a while, fishermen didn't care to go way in there. But the salmon, those was a good, the salmon fishermen, when people started to live here year round, that's, I think, that's when the real conflict started.